For over 40 years, Rabbi Nathaniel Abramson had been a pillar of the Jewish community in the heart of Chicago. At 70 years old, his voice still carried the weight of wisdom earned through a lifetime of devotion. Born into a family of Polish Jewish immigrants who had survived war and exile, Nathaniel's childhood was steeped in sacred tradition. His earliest memories were of his grandfather's trembling voice, reciting the Shema at sunrise, and the scent of freshly baked challah drifting from the kitchen every Sabbath. Torah wasn't just a book in their home. It was the heartbeat of their lives. From a young age, Nathaniel showed a rare hunger for scripture. While other boys played baseball in the alley, he sat cross-legged under his father's tall oak tree, memorizing Leviticus and poring over rabbinical commentaries. Becoming a rabbi was not a career choice. It was a calling etched into his very soul. He graduated from Yeshiva University and soon found himself leading a historic synagogue on the north side of the city. Every Friday night he stood before the congregation wrapped in his prayer shawl, chanting ancient melodies that echoed through the stained glass sanctuary. He officiated weddings, presided over funerals, named newborns, and offered counsel to the heartbroken. His faith was unshakable, rooted in the belief that the law of Moses was the surest path to righteousness. His days began before dawn, binding tefillin to his arms and forehead, whispering blessings as the first light crept across Lake Michigan. Nathaniel was respected by Jews and non-Jews alike, even earning honorary recognition from local interfaith councils for his work in community healing. To many, he was not just a spiritual leader, but a living bridge between generations, an anchor in a world that felt increasingly adrift. Yet beneath his stoic composure, there lived a quiet confidence, even pride, in the clarity of his beliefs. He had never questioned the teachings of the Torah or doubted the path he had walked. That is, until the winter his body began to betray him. What started as a dull ache in his side would soon unravel everything he thought he knew about life, death, and the God he had served so faithfully. It began in the middle of December, just days before the first snowfall touched down across Chicago. Rabbi Nathaniel Abramson had been helping his grandson hang garland across the living room mantel. A harmless task, really, when a sharp pain pierced just beneath his right ribcage. He paused, brushed it off with a smile, and told his wife, Leah, that it was probably nothing but a pulled muscle. But the pain didn't go away. Over the next few weeks it grew more insistent, accompanied by an unrelenting fatigue that made walking up the stairs feel like scaling Mount Sinai. He lost nearly 10 pounds without even trying, and the color in his face faded to a sallow gray. Still, he pressed on. After all, the synagogue's Hanukkah service was coming up, and the community needed him. He had made a career out of pushing through discomfort, through funerals, personal loss, and long winter nights when hope felt scarce. But this was different. Leah, his ever-watchful companion of 47 years, noticed the change long before he admitted it. One morning, as he sat slumped at the breakfast table, barely touching his scrambled eggs, she reached across and gently touched his hand. "Nate," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you need to see a doctor." He relented, more to quiet her fears than because he believed anything serious was happening. After a whirlwind of scans, blood tests, and whispered hallway consults, the truth came crashing down. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The oncologist's voice was clinical, detached, but the words hit like a freight train. In that sterile exam room, under the hum of fluorescent lights, Nathaniel felt the air thicken, as if the weight of mortality had suddenly settled on his chest. He tried to stand tall, to recite Psalm 121 beneath his breath, as he had done for so many of his congregants in their own hospital beds. "I lift up my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from?" But this time, the words didn't comfort him. They sounded distant, almost hollow, like echoes in a canyon. Leah clutched his hand, her eyes brimming with tears she refused to let fall. The weeks that followed were a blur of chemotherapy appointments, nights drenched in sweat, and mornings where the taste of metal lingered on his tongue. His once strong voice, the same voice that had comforted mourners and chanted sacred texts, now cracked when he tried to read aloud. The synagogue board suggested he take a sabbatical, and he agreed, not because he wanted to, but because he had no strength left to resist. Alone in the quiet of their home, wrapped in a blanket by the fireplace, Nathaniel began to feel the slow unraveling of everything he had built. Not just his body, but his certainty, his spiritual armor, and the foundation he had stood on for 7 decades. And somewhere in that silence, a question began to form, not from theology or tradition, but from the very marrow of his soul. What if there's more? By late January, the bitter Chicago winds howled through the windows of Rabbi Nathaniel Abramson's modest home, like ancient spirits calling from another world. His body had grown gaunt, just 128 pounds now, and he could barely walk from the bedroom to the living room without pausing to catch his breath. The pain in his side had become a constant companion, gnawing at him like a dull blade. But it was the fatigue that wore him down the most. His days passed in a fog of medications, naps, and whispered prayers that no longer lifted the veil of dread hanging over him. The once vibrant man who stood at the bima in his tallit, chanting blessings with a voice like thunder, now spoke only in hoarse whispers. He had stopped attending services weeks ago. The sanctuary felt too far, too full of questions he no longer had answers for. That night, one of those bone-cold Midwestern nights where the frost clings to your windows and silence stretches on like eternity, something shifted. He had just finished sipping half a cup of lukewarm tea when the tightness in his chest returned, sharper this time, like a steel band wrapping around his ribs. Leah rushed to his side, her voice trembling as she begged to call 911. But Nathaniel shook his head. He didn't want to die in a hospital bed under harsh fluorescent lights, surrounded by tubes and machines. He wanted to be home, with her, with the memories, with the family photographs on the walls that told the story of a life faithfully lived. As he sank into his recliner, wrapped in his old wool blanket, he felt an overwhelming sense of heaviness, not just in his body, but in his soul. The pain grew worse, his breaths came shorter. The world around him began to dim. He tried to speak, to recite the Modeh Ani, the morning prayer of gratitude he'd said every day since he was a boy, but the words wouldn't come. Leah's face blurred before him, her hands clutching his, tears finally escaping down her cheeks. Then, everything went black. But it wasn't an end. In the next instant, he became aware of something strange. He was no longer in his body. He hovered a few feet above it, watching the scene unfold below like a dream he couldn't wake from. His physical form sat limp in the chair, head tilted to one side. Leah knelt beside him, shaking his shoulders and calling his name, her sobs raw and frantic. His children, who had been visiting for the weekend, rushed in from the den, their faces pale with horror. The panic in the room was deafening, but Nathaniel felt nothing. No fear, no pain. Just a strange calm, as though the weight he had carried for 70 years had suddenly lifted. He tried to speak, to reassure them that he was still there, but no words came. He reached for Leah, but his hand passed through her like mist. That's when he realized he was no longer bound by the laws of the world he had known. The moment was surreal, almost serene. Time didn't seem to pass the same way anymore. Then, out of the corner of his awareness, something began to change. A soft light, barely more than a flicker, appeared at the far edge of the room. It wasn't from a lamp or the hallway. It was alive, pulsing gently like it had a heartbeat of its own. And it was calling to him, not with words but with something deeper. A pull, a warmth, a whisper of peace. As the cries and chaos faded behind him, Nathaniel drifted toward the glow, unaware that he was about to step into a realm that would shake the very foundation of everything he thought he knew about God, eternity, and the truth. The light wasn't like anything Rabbi Nathaniel Abramson had ever seen. It wasn't harsh like the sterile glare of hospital bulbs, nor was it ethereal like moonlight glistening on Lake Michigan. It was warm, alive, and inviting, like a fire on a winter night, or the sun cutting through synagogue windows on a Saturday morning. As he drifted toward it, the noise of the world, Leah's sobs, the panicked cries of his children, the distant sirens, faded into a gentle hush. The warmth wrapped around him like a shawl, cradling his spirit in a way that reminded him of his mother's arms when he was a boy. He felt no weight, no pain, no fear. For the first time in months, there was only peace. The light grew brighter but never blinding. As it expanded, it began to take shape, not as a place, but as a presence. Nathaniel felt himself being drawn inward, as if the light itself was opening a doorway to something far beyond comprehension. And then the images began. Not on a screen, not before his eyes, but inside the light, as if it held his memories like film reels. He saw himself as a child in his father's study, running his fingers across the raised lettering of the Torah scroll. He saw the look of pride in his father's eyes the day he delivered his first Devar Torah at age 13. The memory shifted to his wedding day, Leah's trembling smile as they stood beneath the chuppah, the smell of roses in the spring air, the laughter of loved ones. More scenes appeared. His ordination, the bris ceremonies he led, the hospital bedsides where he had spoken words of comfort, the funerals where he'd wept alongside grieving families. These were not just memories. They were alive, saturated with color and feeling. And in each one, Nathaniel felt an echo of purpose. A life well lived, or so he thought. But then, just as quickly, something changed. The light around him began to dim, not all at once, but slowly, as if someone were drawing down a shade. The warmth cooled, and a silence crept in that wasn't peaceful, but heavy and unnatural. Nathaniel felt a chill settle over him, and instinctively he began reciting Psalm 23. But the words fell flat, swallowed by the growing darkness. The images changed too. They were no longer warm, joyous moments. They were twisted, distorted, like paintings left out in the rain. Shapes emerged from the shadows. Figures at first. Human, but not quite. Their faces were hollow, twisted in expressions of agony. They reached out, not in greeting but in desperation. Their moans were not words, but cries that pierced Nathaniel's soul. He wanted to turn away, but something kept him rooted. These weren't just lost souls. There was something familiar about them. One looked like a man he had once argued with in the hospital about matters of faith. Another resembled a congregant who had drifted from the synagogue years before. Men, women, even children, faces contorted in torment, as if trapped in a moment of regret that never ended. Nathaniel tried to cry out, but his voice had no echo. Fear, unlike anything he'd ever known, clutched at him. These souls weren't just suffering. They were begging. And he couldn't help them. He had no answers. The theological confidence he had worn like armor all his life shattered in that moment. He wasn't a rabbi. He wasn't a teacher. He was just a soul, stripped bare in the presence of something terribly real. Then, cutting through the weeping, came a voice. Not from around him, but within him. Deep, resonant, neither cruel nor soft, just true. "Nathaniel," it said. Everything fell silent, and in that instant he knew. This voice wasn't human. It was the voice of the one he had spoken about for 70 years, yet never truly known. The voice called his name again. Nathaniel. It echoed through the void like a wave rolling across a still lake, carrying with it not fear, but a weight that went straight to the core of his being. Nathaniel Abramson stood motionless in the dimness, his soul trembling, stripped of title, robe, and ritual. He had been called rabbi his whole adult life. People looked to him for answers, for wisdom, for comfort. But here, where time and matter unraveled, there was no congregation, no Torah scroll, no ark behind him. Only this voice, and a question that rose from the silence like thunder on a clear night. Have you truly known me? The question was not accusatory. It wasn't asked with anger. If anything, it was asked with heartbreak. But it cut deeper than any sermon Nathaniel had ever delivered. His mind reached for answers, for scripture, for the teachings he had clung to for over 70 years. He had read every word of the Tanakh. He had spent decades studying the oral traditions, quoting the sages, leading services, mourning with the grieving, and rejoicing with the newlywed. He had devoted his life to God, hadn't he? But the more he searched for the right words to answer, the more his soul ached with an unsettling realization. He had known about God. But had he truly known him? The darkness around him shifted once more. Out of it emerged a figure, first just a silhouette within the fading gloom. But then, as if the light recognized him, the form grew clearer. A man, dressed simply, walking along a dusty road with a peace in his stride and an authority in his presence that surpassed even the mightiest prophets Nathaniel had ever studied. People surrounded him. Fishermen, mothers, children, the poor, the broken. Their eyes were fixed on him not with fear, but with love. When he spoke, Nathaniel couldn't make out the words, but he felt them deep inside, like chords vibrating within his chest. He knew who this was. His soul knew before his mind caught up. Jesus. Nathaniel had heard his name thousands of times over the years, on street corners, on television, in books he never dared to open. He had dismissed him as a figure for the Gentiles, a deviation from truth, a misunderstanding of Torah. And yet, here he stood, not as an idea, not as a symbol, but as a presence so real, so overwhelming in peace and compassion, that Nathaniel could barely stand beneath it. More images flooded the air around them, not memories but revelations. He saw Abraham raising the knife on Mount Moriah, and then saw a lamb in his place. He saw Moses receiving the tablets on Sinai, and then saw a man lifting a loaf of bread saying, "This is my body, given for you." The commandments, the sacrifices, the Passover, the tabernacle, all the traditions Nathaniel had lived and breathed now shimmered like reflections pointing to this man, like signposts on a road he had never finished walking. Jesus stepped forward, his eyes locking with Nathaniel's. They weren't eyes of judgment. They were filled with tears. "You have known the law and the prophets," he said, his voice like a melody Nathaniel had known all his life but never heard sung. "But the fullness of truth stands before you now." Nathaniel fell to his knees. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The weight of this moment, of a life spent in pursuit of truth, now rested on his shoulders like an ancient mantle. "Why me?" he managed to whisper. "Why now?" Jesus knelt beside him, placing a hand, warm, solid, real, on Nathaniel's shoulder. "Because you asked. You sought truth, even when it frightened you. That is where the journey begins." Tears rolled down Nathaniel's face, not from shame, but from release. The burden of performance, of ritual, of striving, lifted. He had tried to build his ladder to heaven one rung at a time through law, tradition, and legacy. But now he saw the ladder had already been lowered from above. and it bore the scars of one who had climbed down to meet him. "Nathaniel," Jesus said, standing again, his voice both thunder and whisper, "you were faithful with what you knew. But now, will you follow me into what is true?" The space around them shimmered, pulsing with light, waiting. And in that timeless pause, Nathaniel knew that this was the moment his soul had waited for his entire life. Not death, but invitation. Not condemnation, but homecoming. The return was nothing like the journey out. One moment, Rabbi Nathaniel Abramson stood before Jesus, suspended in light, his soul trembling under the weight of a truth too vast for words. The next, he was yanked backward with a force that felt like falling from heaven into ice water. His body jolted violently, ribs heaving as air surged into his lungs. Blinding fluorescent lights glared above him. The sterile smell of antiseptic and latex filled his nostrils. Monitors beeped frantically. He heard a voice cry out, Leah's, saying his name again and again. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. Had it all been a dream? A final hallucination of a dying brain? But no. The presence still lingered. It pulsed within him like a second heartbeat. "Nathaniel." "Oh, thank God." Leah sobbed, clinging to his frail hand. He tried to speak, but his throat burned like fire. A nurse leaned over him, adjusting something on the IV drip. "Rabbi Abramson, don't try to talk yet. You coded. We brought you back." Back. But to what? The days that followed were a blur of recovery and reflection. Doctors and nurses called it a miracle. At 70 years old, with late-stage pancreatic cancer and 6 minutes without a pulse, no one expected him to survive. Yet there he was, weak but breathing, his vitals gradually stabilizing. His children took turns staying by his bedside. Friends from the synagogue sent flowers and cards. Congregants whispered blessings over the phone, thankful their beloved rabbi had returned. But inside, Nathaniel felt like a man caught between two worlds. He had come back to the same room, the same body, the same city. But he was no longer the same. At first he told no one, not Leah, not his children, not even the attending chaplain, about what he had seen. How could he? How do you explain that everything you believed was only part of the story? That the law you spent your life defending pointed to someone you had spent your life avoiding? He tried to return to the rhythms of his faith. He recited morning blessings, opened his prayer book, even turned the pages of the Torah. But it felt different now. Not wrong, but incomplete. Like reading the first half of a letter and sensing there was more. The words were still beautiful, still sacred. But something was missing. Or rather, someone. Late one night, unable to sleep, Nathaniel sat alone in the hospital's tiny chapel. It was non-denominational, sparsely decorated, with a single cross tucked in the corner. He stared at it for a long time, not in defiance, but in curiosity. His heart beat slowly, methodically. That same question echoed again in his spirit. "Will you follow me?" He whispered, "I don't know how." The next day, during a slow walk through the hospital's lower corridor, he passed a chaplain's office with the door ajar. Inside sat an elderly black man with kind eyes and a calm demeanor. He looked up and smiled warmly. "You're Rabbi Abramson," he said. "We've all been praying for you." Nathaniel hesitated, then stepped inside. The man introduced himself as Pastor Reuben James, a retired Pentecostal minister who volunteered with the hospital's end-of-life care team. Nathaniel sat down and, with a voice still raspy from the ventilator, began to speak. He told Reuben everything. The pain, the collapse, the light, the question, the face, the voice, the tears. Jesus. Pastor Reuben didn't flinch. He listened the way a seasoned soul listens, with patience, humility, and no agenda. When Nathaniel finished, the silence hung heavy in the room. "Brother," Reuben said gently, "sounds like the Lord reached across a whole lifetime to touch you. That's a holy gift. But gifts like that, they don't fit neatly into old boxes." He handed Nathaniel a worn copy of the New Testament. "This won't replace what you know. It'll complete it." Nathaniel stared at the book in his hands. He had never held one before. Not like this. Not without fear. That night in the quiet of his hospital room, under the hum of machines, he opened to the Gospel of John and read slowly, carefully. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." His hands trembled, but not from fear. Something was beginning. The decision didn't come in a dramatic flash of lightning or thunder. It came in the quiet, steady drip of a hospital fee and the whisper of pages turning under a weak but willing hand. Nathaniel Abramson, once a towering pillar of Chicago's Jewish community, made the choice not out of rebellion or emotion, but from a stillness that had settled deep in his soul since the night he died and met the one he had never dared to truly see. Jesus. The name still felt foreign on his lips, but familiar in his heart. And when he finally whispered, "Yes, I will follow you," he knew it would change everything. After 2 weeks in the hospital, Nathaniel returned home to his apartment near Lincoln Park. The once comforting surroundings now felt different, like a museum of a life that had ended and left only artifacts behind. The bookshelves lined with rabbinical texts, the tallit folded neatly in its embroidered bag, the mezuzah on the doorframe. These things weren't meaningless. They were no longer enough. He still cherished the Torah, still prayed in Hebrew, still lit candles with Leah on Friday nights. But now there was something more. Someone, dwelling within the walls of his heart. Jesus was no longer a distant figure from another religion. He was the fulfillment of everything Nathaniel had spent his life longing for. Telling Leah was the hardest moment of all. She sat beside him at the kitchen table one foggy morning in February, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of chamomile tea. Nathaniel looked at her, his eyes soft but resolute. "I have to tell you something," he began. And he did. Slowly, carefully, he shared the whole story, from the chest pains to the light, to the vision, to the voice. When he said the name Jesus, her eyes filled with tears. Not of anger, but of sorrow. "You're leaving everything we built," she whispered. "Not leaving," he replied. "I'm continuing. But now I see where it was always pointing." His children didn't understand. Some stopped calling. One son blocked his number entirely. Friends from the synagogue kept their distance. A few old colleagues even sent word through mutual acquaintances that he should no longer attend the rabbinical council meetings. Overnight, the man who had officiated hundreds of weddings, bar mitzvahs, and funerals had become a stranger in his own community. But Nathaniel was not alone. He began attending a small Bible study group led by Pastor Reuben at a local church tucked between a dry cleaner and a used bookstore on the west side. The group was small, only 8 people, most of them in their 60s or older, each with their own winding path to faith. There were no fancy lights, no band, no stage, just folding chairs, coffee and foam cups, and a well-worn Bible in every lap. It was there that Nathaniel found something he hadn't known he needed: grace. Not earned, not recited, not ritualized, just freely given. And it changed him. He never stopped loving the traditions he grew up with. But now, when he read Isaiah 53, he saw not just prophecy, but fulfillment. When he lit the menorah, he saw Jesus, the light of the world. When he broke bread, he thought of the one who broke himself for humanity. And when he prayed, he no longer felt he was reaching upward into silence. He felt the presence of the one who had reached down to find him. Nathaniel Abramson was no longer just a rabbi. He was a follower, a witness, a bridge between what was and what is. And though the cost was high, he never looked back. Because once you've seen the face of truth, nothing else will ever satisfy. The story of Rabbi Nathaniel Abramson offers a deeply moving reminder that it is never too late to encounter truth, and never too far to return to the heart of God. A man who spent his life faithfully walking in tradition found, at the end of his strength, that even a lifetime of religious devotion can leave the soul longing for something more. A personal relationship, not just ritual. A savior, not just structure. His journey shows that faith is not static, but living and unfolding, and that the search for truth often requires the courage to leave behind comfort, reputation, and certainty. For those in their later years, this story speaks to the sacred value of asking the deeper questions. Have I truly known God, or only known about Him? Have I followed teachings, or have I followed the teacher himself? Nathaniel's transformation didn't negate his past. It fulfilled it. Every law he had loved found its meaning in grace. Every verse he had memorized came alive in the light of Jesus. His willingness to seek, even when it cost him everything familiar, reveals a powerful truth. Obedience to God sometimes leads through the doorways we were once taught to avoid, but the reward is worth it. Peace, presence, purpose renewed. For those who feel like their time has passed or their faith has plateaued, Nathaniel's story is a whisper of hope. It's not too late. The path you've walked may have been sacred, but the one who made you is still calling. And when he calls your name, the only response that matters is the one that says, "Here I am. I will follow."